Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. This is the episode for March 10th, 2022. And I think we're going to title this one Fascist Mythology Behind Demonization of Russia. At the top of the list, we have US-Nato planning Barbarossa 2.0 against the Russian Federation. This is pretty interesting here. Barbarossa 1.0, of course, was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union back in 1941. Where the Nazis initially took over about 1/3 of the entire Soviet Union, but the Soviets got them back eventually. So what is Barbarossa 2.0? Well, this is something that the US-Nato, we crammed that into actually one word, US-Nato, because NATO is actually a beast of the United States. It's controlled by the United States. It's paid for by the United States and several European countries, but the European countries there are basically junior partners in this enterprise. So it's a plan that US-Nato is cooking up. Can the West arrange a large-scale military provocation against Russia and use Ukraine as a Trojan horse? According to confidential sources, the NATO General Staff is considering any scenario to throw Russia into the flames of war, even if it takes to resort to nuclear weapons. It seems that we are witnessing Operation Barbarossa 2.0 plan unfolding before our very eyes. NATO uses Ukraine as a Trojan horse to strike nuclear blow on Russia. In 2018, the former head of internal security service of the Internal Security Service for the French Ministry of the Interior, General Yvan Blot, a former member of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee of France, sent me a document, and this is the author talking here. The author is a guy who's worked in European security issues for a long time. Sent me a document that he asked to make public only after his death. He died the same year. This is in 2018. The document is a summary in German of the minutes of the NATO meeting to elaborate the Barbarossa II plan. It goes about the plan to create permanent hotbeds of tension on the borders with Russia, organize provocations against local Russian-speaking population, and openly prepare for a war with Russia. At the same time, judging from conversations with several French generals, the author of this article came to realize that NATO was planning its attack on Russia through Ukraine rather than directly. As we all can see now, the document was not just a waste of paper. Unfortunately, there is even more terrible information to it. It concerns a possibility of a nuclear provocation on the border with Russia to develop a large-scale conflict on the European continent. On Saturday, February 19th, after the start of the large-scale Ukrainian aggression in Donbass, one of my sources at the Commission on Defense and Security of the European Union contacted me and said that in order to implement Operation Barbarossa II, they may arrange the delivery of a US nuclear warhead from Germany to Ukraine. American nuclear weapons are stationed in Germany at Buchel base, where up to 20 B-61 hydrogen bombs can be stored. Virtually all parties of Germany oppose the nuclear arsenal, from the Alliance 90 Greens, the Left Party, to the Free Democratic Party of Germany. Nonetheless, the current Minister of Defense, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, welcomed the modernization of these weapons, as well as a possibility to acquire new carriers to develop them to the target FA-18 Super Hornet aircraft. According to confirmed reports, the warhead could have been sent to a NATO base in Estonia. Multinational battalions of the North Atlantic Alliance have been stationed there for almost 6 years now. The Estonian Tapa Army base constantly receives new types of weapons that come by sea from Western Europe. The source suggests the warhead could subsequently end up in Kharkiv. I guess that's Kharkiv, where at the hysterical demand of the Ukrainian government, the United States should deploy THAAD anti-missile defense batteries. It is worth noting here that these American anti-missiles do not have a warhead at all, but are designed to shoot down targets with the help of kinetic energy. This weapon was developed against the ancient Soviet missile R-17, the production of which had been discontinued in 1988. Reportedly, Belarus has several launchers left, albeit they have not been in combat duty for long already. Of course, THAAD systems are useless against maneuverable weapons, as their missiles do not fly at speeds higher than Mach 3. It brings up the question here, does Kiev really intend to place a THAAD in the Kharkiv region? Maybe it does. It goes about a completely different missile system, like the Aegis Ashur or the Mk-41. Unlike the extremely useless THAAD, the Mk-41, as Western experts assure, is a weapon of both defensive and offensive potentials. This deck-based vertical launch container can be used to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The combat radius of such a system corresponds to medium-range and short-range missiles. Moscow is only 647 kilometers away from Kharkiv in a straight line. Washington may well consider the following scenario. As soon as the Ukrainian army goes to an offensive in Donbass, Russia will be advised not to interfere in those events, as Kiev may use nuclear weapons against Moscow. A motto has been going viral in Ukrainian social media lately. We baptize Moscow, and we will read the last rites to it too. And this, by the way, is just highlights from this article. There's a lot more to it, and the link will be available to you under this video. So please take a look and read the whole thing.
It's too late for it to be used as a Trojan horse because Russia has already caught on, hasn't it? And as you were saying last week, Ukraine now effectively has no Air Force or Navy. But it sounds like in desperation, they're trying to carry out some additional provocation, maybe a series of false flags that it sounds like they're going to try to draw more countries in the region into this war. Right. Poland, Latvia, the Czech Republic, those are the top three, I'd say, because those countries, in addition to being right in the area, have all enacted legislation criminalizing support for Russia in this conflict that's been occurring these last 8 years. Poland, Latvia, the Czech Republic, they all have made it illegal, punishable by years potentially, to support Russia's actions. And this is a sign of Nazism for obvious reasons. It's totally anti-democratic and fanatically Russia-phobic. So these are clearly going to be used as launching pads for this provocation.
Yeah. Well, my news last week that the Ukrainian Air Force was basically destroyed. There's some news today on that coming from Poland, I think it is. Poland has flown its entire Air Force to Ukrainian bases now. And they're giving their entire Air Force to Ukraine. A lot of good it'll do them because the Russians still have basically effectively a no-fly zone over Ukraine. So anything that the Poles / Ukrainians put up in the air would obviously be knocked out of the air pretty quick. So I don't know what we'll see out of that, but we'll see something, I guess. Yeah. Very interesting stuff. This I found this article really interesting and compelling. This is from 2018 that NATO was planning this shit. You know, think about it. In my opinion, the Russians struck just in time. The Ukrainians were within days of launching an all-out devastating attack on Donbass, which the Russians thwarted. The Russians took them out just in the nick of time. And NATO, from what I can see, it looks like NATO's plans have been thwarted, at least in the short run. In the long run, this confrontation is yet to happen. Ukraine is just one of the plots US-NATO is cooking up. So next on the list, the fascist mythology behind the demonization of Russia and its denazification effort in Ukraine.
For the last 80 years, not more like the last 90 years, since the famine in Ukraine that started off the demonization of Stalin as a supposed creator of famine, the Nazis
that was 1932.
Yes, 90th anniversary now. That's kind of the original big lie when it comes to Ukrainian nationalism. This idea that Stalin deliberately starved Ukraine was started by Goebbels, and it was proliferated by the media empire of the U.S. oligarch William Randolph Hearst. Throughout the last 9 decades, it's been getting promoted by anti-communists for the ultimate goal, it seems, of making history repeat itself, because the whole rationale for the Ukrainian nationalist aggressions against these newly independent republics, against the Russian-speaking peoples in that region, against dissidents, Jews, Romas in general, has been that these nationalists are supposedly trying to overcome a historic injustice that the Russians have supposedly exacted upon them. They're portraying themselves as victims of genocide carried out by Russia. And obviously this has carried through despite the Soviet Union itself no longer existing. Anti-communism is obviously integral to Russophobia. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing a demonization of Putin that is kind of portraying him as the new Stalin, with Stalin filling their designated role as the great villain, equivalent to Hitler. And if you ask the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, way worse than Hitler. They actually believe that Hitler did no wrong. They're portraying Stalin as the perpetrator of genocide, and that's where the whole rationale for these aggressions and actually genocidal actions from the Ukrainian regime have come from.
Yeah, this mythology of all of a sudden, starting in 1917, all of the famines that were with the Russian lands as far back as you can go in history. There were famines. There were failures of crops. This was an ongoing thing. Happened every 20 or 30 years. But as soon as 1917 happened, as soon as the Russian Revolution happened, it was Russia's fault. Even though Russia, in the end, solved the problem so that there were no more famines. They never mentioned that. But in 1932, Ukraine, which at that time was part of the Soviet Union, suffered a famine, just like they had for ongoing generations upon generations into the ancient past. As long as human beings lived there were these famines and crop failures. But the Nazis, starting in 1932, blame the Soviet Union for that. And the same thing happened in China when the Chinese Revolution happened in 1949. There were famines and crop failures, and there were floods, and there were any kind of natural disaster that could possibly be blamed. It was Mao's fault. Mao deliberately did that. Stalin deliberately did that. This is just crazy. It doesn't take a lot of common sense to see just how evil and crazy, how Nazi-like this claim is. And yet the American empire still claims Holodomor, or whatever the fuck they call it, to this very day. They got it from the Nazis. Next on our list, the U.S. empire's evils as described by its former servants.
This pertains to William Bloom, the man we discussed a few months ago, and I mentioned
my good buddy. I worked with him and knew him very, very well. He's a wonderful guy. He's passed away now, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
He describes these evils that the U.S. empire carried out, as does who's the other guy? He's the guy who said, "I used to work as a gangster for capitalism."
Oh, that's what's his name? War is a Racket. Smedley Butler.
Smedley Butler. And then more recently, there was the former U.S. military official who described in 2018 why the U.S. has been in Afghanistan. He says it's to counter China geopolitically in the long term. And he was saying how the Uyghurs are being used as weapons in this battle against China. And he did say that at that point, he believed it was only a possibility that the Uyghurs would be weaponized in this way. But now it's confirmed with the intensification of the Uyghur propaganda against China that they do aim to foment terrorism. And this actually ties back to what we were just talking about the idea that a state would try to deliberately starve the people of another state. There are real life examples of this, which makes this Holodomor propaganda more believable and insidious. there are real life examples of countries doing this, but it's always carried out by the imperialists or by those who work for them. Right now, Washington is deliberately starving the Afghanistan people to fulfill what that guy was talking about, to fulfill the goal of weakening Afghanistan and keeping it unable to be developed by China's Belt and Road Initiative. These are the evils that he was implicitly exposing when he told the truth about Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's simply amazing how many of these people spend their lives practically as servants of the American empire. And they go into it always as bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, innocent victims, basically. They go into it thinking that they're doing something good. And the more they do what they do, they see this is very bad, what they do. Next on the list, Global South stands with Russia. And this one comes from, let's see here. This one comes from Workers' World Party, from Workers' World, the Workers' World Party newspaper. And they say, as the US and NATO work to advance their war against Russia, now breaking out in Ukraine, many countries who have experienced imperialist aggression by the US, France, Britain, and other NATO members are speaking out. They are denouncing the impact of US sanctions as acts of war and calling NATO the threat to global peace. The Bolivarian Alliance for the People of Our America, ALBA, as it's called, is an intergovernmental organization of countries based in Latin America and the Caribbean based on social, political, and economic integration. Many member states have been targets of US intervention and economic sanctions intended to derail popular elected progressive governments. Collectively, they are speaking out against the US-NATO aggression against Russia. Bolivian indigenous leader Evo Morales, former president, called NATO a serious threat to international peace and security. Its record of invasions and aggressions proves it. Now, its expansionist attempt is one of the main reasons for the situation in Ukraine. In 2019, the government led by Morales was overthrown by a right-wing coup directed by the US. A year later, Morales's movement towards Socialism Party was restored to government in a popular election. Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela's ambassador, Samuel Moncada, who addressed, he's the ambassador to the UN, who addressed the March 2 UN General Assembly special session on Ukraine, echoes Morales' sentiments. We regret to note that the current escalation, with the painful and terrible loss of life it has entailed, originates from the breach of the Minsk agreements under the encouragement of the United States of the permanent expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe. Quote, Venezuela has always condemned the perverse tendency towards unilateral and hegemonic visions of the world, which disregard the principles of diplomacy, organize invasions with total impunity in countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and promote media shields that limit freedom of expression and manipulate opinions and emotions to increase xenophobia and hate speech. Addressing the emergency session on Ukraine, Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso Cuesta, Cuba's permanent representative to the UN, stated, U.S. determination to continue NATO's progressive expansion towards the Russian Federation borders has brought about a scenario with implications of unpredictable scope, which could have been avoided. The United States and the NATO military moves in recent months towards regions adjacent to the Russian Federation, preceded by the delivery of modern weapons to Russia, which altogether add up to a military siege, are well known. Ignoring for decades the well-funded claims of the Russian Federation for security guarantees and assuming that Russia would remain defenseless in the face of a direct threat to its national security was a mistake. Peace cannot be achieved by sieging or cornering states. History will hold the U.S. accountable for the consequences of an increasingly offensive military doctrine outside NATO's borders, which threatens international peace, security, and stability. So that's just some of this article. The article is much more extensive, and I invite you to read it. The link will be under this video.
You know, this makes my mind go to the news I've been seeing about how Russian leftists have been protesting against this intervention effort. And it makes me really, it makes me cautious more than anything else, because I don't want to make any strong conclusions when it comes to this phenomenon of leftists, opponents of Putin's anti-communist regime, protesting against this intervention that we've definitely discussed the benefits of. On the one hand, the benefits of this intervention has been that, it's kept a belligerent neo-Nazi regime in check, but apparently there are drawbacks to this. And, it makes me think, and this is where the caution comes in, are we being fed just one type of perspective when it comes to the left in Russia? Are these leftist outlets that we're encountering throughout the Western world trying to get us on the side of the Ukrainian regime by only selectively showing us these perspectives? Because God knows the left has been weaponized when it comes to all these places that Washington wants regime change within. These regime change agents always try to get us on the side of their agenda, despite us being on the left, by appealing to leftist ideals. And this is kind of off topic, but that general theme of socialist countries, socialist leaders standing in solidarity with Putin on this issue makes me think of that.
Well, a couple facts here. First of all, when they say the left in Russia, what they're talking about is not the left. What they're talking about is liberals.
Yeah, that's what I suspected.
Liberals make up about 10% of the Russian people. 10%. Liberalism is not a very popular ideology in Russia.
Good.
And I can guarantee you, I've seen it. I've seen their placards. I've seen their signs, their banners of these demonstrations. They are liberals. And liberalism is not leftism. Liberalism is not the left. Liberals, the core element of liberalism is defense of capitalism and imperialism, pure and simple. That is a wonderful description. When you look at all the liberals in the world, here in the United States and everywhere else in the world, including Russia, liberalism is the defense of capitalism and imperialism. And how in fuck do you call that left? In what kind of a world is that the left? So that's number one. Number two, the second largest party in Russia is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And I will guarantee you the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is 100% behind this rescue operation by Putin in Ukraine. And how do I know that? I know it because I read their statement on it. And that's what their statement says very clearly. That's the left in Russia, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. That is the left. I mean, there are other communist parties that are also left, much smaller. But the second largest party in Russia after Putin's party is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And they're not out there marching with the liberals. And they don't consider liberals to be the left. That is the most insane, crazy thing that we only have in the United States, to call liberals the left. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
I see. So it sounds like I've been vulnerable, not quite manipulated, but vulnerable to this kind of manipulation because of my environment, where all the anti-war protests I've ever encountered have come from the genuine left, or at least been supported by the communist movement within the United States, because that's the nature of where we are. The core of imperialism, all the wars we wage are unjustifiable, whereas in Russia, the circumstances are quite different. They're on the opposite side of the imperialist, anti-imperialist conflict. And when you see stuff like this, these kinds of anti-war protests, what you're actually seeing are calls for Russia to have its hands behind its back. Well, probably millions of lives get imperiled by belligerent, really scary regime to the West.
Right. This whole thing, it's just so ridiculous that what is a just war? A just war is a defensive war, first of all. A just war is a war in defense of people, and especially in defense of your own country. A unjust war is a war of theft. In Ukraine today, the unjust war is the war launched by NATO, the US-Nato, and the using the Ukraine Nazis, the Nazis and fascists of Ukraine, to attack the people of the Donbass. That's an unjust war. Coming to their defense, that's defensive. That's a defensive war. It's pretty simple when you think about it. Okay, next on the list, let's see where we're at here. Imperialism's lack of sustainability makes capitalism's implosion inevitable.
It's a complex topic that can actually be summarized in a pretty simple way. Mao predicted that something like 90%, over 90% of the world's population will ultimately rise up against imperialism. And that means that eventually the reactionaries in the core of imperialism are going to be in a conundrum where even if they have millions of foot soldiers at the ready to defend capital from the social movements that will be rising unprecedentedly at that point, they will lack the capital to sustain their operations. Capital in the core of imperialism, by definition, depends on parasitism, a parasitic relationship with the global south, with the rest of the world. And when the imperial center can no longer exploit the rest of the world, it is no longer going to be able to sustain its capital. And that means that however strong the fascist movement will become in the United States in the coming decades, and by extension in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the European imperialist countries, it's not going to be enough to offset this deficit that's already here and is going to keep getting bigger. Already we're seeing the consequences that imperial decline and the subsequent reactions from the empire to that decline are having on capital in the center imperialist countries. These sanctions on Russia are further isolating the imperialist countries and creating blowback that will ultimately be worse for the people here than for the people of Russia. And the only defense that the liberals have is that you should be happy to be paying more for gas because that's the cost of freedom. That's quite literally what these
I've seen several liberals doing that on Facebook just today. It's funny. Yeah, you should love the $10 a gallon gas prices because we're fighting for the Ukraine Nazis. Yeah, this is really accelerating. This whole lack of sustainability and implosion, the inevitable implosion, is really accelerating right before our eyes. We've seen it just in the last week with, for instance, Biden's sanctions vis-a-vis banks and the SWIFT banking exchange system. It's totally backfired already. Russia simply jumped on board with China's already existing alternative to SWIFT and is doing just fine as a result. The third world is now scrambling to jump on board with China's alternative to SWIFT now that they've seen that the US has weaponized SWIFT and is using it as a weapon against Russia. This is not hurting Russia. This is hurting Biden. With all these sanctions, most of them are not really all that impactful against Americans. Americans are pretty much shielded, but Europeans are being crushed economically by these sanctions. The sanctions that Biden puts on Russia, they are crushing the European economy. Ceasefire, but Russia pledges to destroy all foreign arms in Ukraine. And this article comes from Barr, I think. Yeah. In a press release, the Russian Ministry of Defense said today, March 5th, from 10 p.m., 10 a.m., I'm sorry, Moscow time, the Russian side declares ceasefire and opens humanitarian corridors for the exit of civilians from Mariupol and Volnovakha, the ministry said. On February 28th, the Ministry of Defense reported that the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic were completing a blockade of the city of Mariupol. On March 3rd, on March 3rd, the Russian military department reported a humanitarian catastrophe in Mariupol. The catastrophe is expected to break out in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Sumy. Russia has created all conditions for the safe evacuation of civilians in Ukraine and is ready to organize humanitarian corridors at any time. Tens of thousands of residents remain blockaded in Kiev, Kharkiv, Sumy, Odessa, Mariupol, and other cities. The Ukrainian side does not let them escape to safety. A residential building in Mariupol was blown up by the Azov National Battalion after the opening of humanitarian quarters was announced in Volnovakha and Mariupol. DPR militia representative Busarin said. Russia's precision strike on a military unit in the city of Zhytomyr destroyed an ammunition depot with US-made Javelin anti-tank systems and British NLAW complexes, the Russian Defense Ministry said. The ammunition depot was located on territory of the military unit. It was destroyed as a result of the attack with the use of long-range precision weapons. In total, 2,037 Ukrainian military infrastructure facilities were hit during the operation. The military destroyed 71 command posts and communications centers of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, 89 S-300 Buk M1 and OSA anti-aircraft missile systems, as well as 61 radar stations. So there you have an update from the Russian Ministry of Defense, giving you both the news on the situation with the humanitarian corridors and Russia's continuing attempt to demilitarize the Ukrainian military, basically. I want to say one other thing, because this is something that just happened today. A children's hospital was bombed in Mariupol today, killing 17 people. I'm not sure how many of them were children, but there were undoubtedly a number of children involved in this. And this is an outright false flag event. So we really have to become aware of this, and we will find out more as the days progress. But the US-Nato, along with their proxies in Ukraine, have bombed a children's hospital in Mariupol, and they are blaming it on Russia. All the liberals all over the United States are up in arms. You see it all over Facebook. How dare Putin, that bastard Putin, that sick fuck Putin, he's bombed children at a children's hospital. This is obviously more of the same thing, because they have been doing this for weeks, for months, for years, basically, in the Donbass region. Every shell, every bomb that the Nazis, that the Azov brigade drops on Mariupol and on other parts of the Donbass, they always claim it's Russian. It's the Russians' fault. So the Russians are to blame. So beware of this propaganda.
I see the nature of the disinformation, why there's such a strong orthodoxy that Putin is the one behind all of the slaughter and bloodshed and suffering that's occurring right now. And, it comes back to what I was saying about how for 90 years they've been doing this. For 90 years, they've been blaming pain and suffering and death, whether it's occurred of natural causes or whether it was deliberately brought upon by the reactionaries on Russia. They've been scapegoating Russia the entire time, and we're getting up to a century of this, where they've been fomenting this hysterical Russophobia, where they've been carrying out these false flags. And it's been intensifying in this last decade since the 2014 coup. Now we're seeing the logical conclusion of that. The logical conclusion is a third world war in the age of the atomic bomb. And I want to stop the podcast here. It's getting kind of late. I like what we've covered. I like how you have educated me on the question of the Russian left. And I was basically on the same page from the get-go, but it took me a little bit of extra critical thinking to really see how these images I've been seeing are BS, how these anti-war protests we've been seeing in Russia occur in a different context, fundamentally, from any anti-war protest you would see in the United States. We're in the imperial center, and they're in a country that is not imperialist by socioeconomic analysis, and that is under attack from imperialism.
Right. Here's the important figure to understand about Russia. 9 out of 10 people in Russia wanted and have wanted for 8 fucking years to go into the Donbass and protect their countrymen. 8 long years. And Putin did nothing for 8 years. People were starting to get angry at Putin. Finally, Putin did something. And believe me, those 9 out of 10 people in Russia are very much happy with what is happening now. The only problem is they thought that it should have happened 8 years ago, and so did I. That's the reality. I told you before, 10% of the Russian people are liberals. That's 1 out of 10. If you see any demonstrations, yes, they look big. There's 10,000 here, 5,000 there. They're not really all that big compared to anti-war demonstrations that we've seen here in America in the past. They're quite tiny, actually, but they look kind of big, you know. The people fill the screen, but it's those fucking liberals. The 1 out of 10, the 9 out of 10 in Russia are utterly behind this move by Putin. They don't even see it as Putin's move. They see Putin as dragging his feet for 8 fucking years. That's what they see. And that's why Putin, for quite some time now, his numbers have really been falling. Putin was down to 61% approval rating, which is really low for Putin, because Putin's had much higher approval ratings. But then he went into Ukraine to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and to protect the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian people of Ukraine. And now Putin's ratings have gone up to 69%. Meanwhile, pedophile Joe Biden, his approval ratings are 41%. And that's typical of American presidents in these last few decades. They aren't popular because what they do ultimately does not help the working class in the United States at all. So there you have it. With that, I guess we'll finish up a little early. We've got a couple of points left, but they were not all that important. I think we've made our point here today. So until next time around, I bid you all a sweet adieu. Rainer, thanks so much for everything you do. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. And please join us again next week. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.